Welcome back to Apostles Mailbox, where today we're going to talk a little bit about getting lost in translation. Now, if you're watching the video, you'll see here a picture of my cat Pippin. He is quite fat, though some people might prefer that I would say he is big-boned. And why is that? Well, both of those phrases convey the same information, more or less, but they have a little bit of a different emotional nuance to them, and they might be more acceptable in different contexts. And so while they mean essentially the same thing, they don't actually carry all of the same information when you say those. And in fact, if we consider this picture here, it's like a little lost pet sign. We actually did lose Pippin last weekend. Somewhere throughout the day, the door got opened and he made a break for it. He's an indoor cat, and he spent a few days out on the town. And we, of course, looked for him. We put posts on Facebook, has anybody seen our cat, etc. But eventually what happened was 2 days later, one of our kids was out on the porch and the cat just started, and he was outside meowing. He wanted to be let back in. So we let him back in, and he was hungry and he was missing some tufts of fur. And I think what he discovered was that the outside wasn't perhaps as exciting and glamorous as he had hoped. And so he just came home. And I do earnestly believe that Pippin always knew his way home. So then, if Pippin knew his way home, the question is it appropriate to use the word lost for him? After all, we as a family, his owners, we didn't know where he was. He was lost to us, if you will. But if we could have asked Pippin if he was lost, I'm sure if he could communicate as a cat, he would have said, no, I know exactly where I'm at. I know exactly where the house I used to live in is at. And the evidence for this, of course, is that a couple days later, when he got good and sick of being outside, he just came home. And we let him back in. And he hasn't tried to escape since then. So the question is, lost in whose eyes? And here's one of the dilemmas of language, and the reason that I wanted to talk through this in this episode is because I feel like this topic has been coming up again and again recently for me, and in conversations that I've been having about Scripture and also in other contexts. So today we're going to talk about how language is hard. Now, I say this because for one of the reasons is I have been teaching English to foreigners, to people whose native language is not English. And as we talk about vocabulary and about syntax and about grammar, we often end up in these discussions where people will ask this question like, well, why do you say it this way? Or why somebody said this to me last week and I didn't understand. Could you explain to me what it means? And very often it will take some thinking and some reasoning, and I'll really have to ponder it for a little while, or maybe even look something up, because as a native English speaker, I don't typically think about the reasons that I say things the way that I say them. I just say whatever sounds right? And because I grew up with it, I just intuitively have this sense of what it means. But one of the difficulties with language is that I believe we are overconfident in our reliance upon our ability to understand language. And it crops up in some really unique ways. Okay? One of the reasons that we are overconfident, I think, in our ability to understand language is because we assume that people in all places at all times who speak our language mean the same thing when they use certain words. Okay? So I'll give you a good example, actually, from the Bible here. So in John 14:2, if you read the King James Version, Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many mansions." And when you see that word mansion, and I've unfortunately heard people get really excited about this, right? When you see that word mansion, what picture comes to your mind? You typically, if you're a modern, if you're an American, you hear the word mansion, you think of something like this, like, wow, a big, impressive, nice house. Now that is a mansion. And we don't even stop to think that if we went back to John 14:2, this picture doesn't even really fit in what he says, right? What does he say? In my Father's house are many mansions. Now, I don't know of many houses that this particular building would fit inside of. And I don't think Jesus was saying, God has this like massive building that's his house, and inside it are a bunch of really large, nice houses. And so already we can see indicators that maybe what the King James Version says there in that language maybe didn't mean what we think when we hear the word mansion. And in fact, if you look up in the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, you find that this qualifies as a mansion according to 1828 usage in English. Okay, that definition of Webster's Dictionary, the first definition says a mansion is any place of residence, a house, a habitation. In other words, if somebody lives there, it's a mansion in 1828, regardless of how big or of how small it is. So maybe you look that up in Webster's Dictionary and you go like, oh, okay, so in my Father's house are many houses, are many dwelling places. It still doesn't quite fit. And then we look at this and we go, that dictionary was actually published in 1828, and the King James Version of the Bible was published in 1611. That's right, so 200 years prior to that. So if we go back 200 years from now, we get to about 1828. We have to go back another 200 years to get to 1611 when the King James Bible was translated. And in fact, if we look at that definition a little more closely, we'll say any place of residence, a house, or a habitation. And that's why I think modern translations of the Bible won't use the word mansion, because they realize it's inherently misleading to a modern. When we read the word mansion, we don't think a dwelling place or a place to live. And so a modern translation will just say a dwelling place. In my Father's house are many dwelling places, many places in which you can live, and I'm going to go make one for you. Okay, so maybe in 1611, the word mansion could have referred to somebody's room in a bigger house. Who knows, right? I didn't live there. I'm no expert. But the problem gets even a little bit more. Let's assume that we're working with this 1828 definition of mansion, and we think, okay, so maybe this is what a Jew would have heard in Jesus' day. But houses in Israel don't look like that in the first century. So I went online and I found a guy using the name Jamethy from sketchfab. He had made a 3D model of his rendering of what he thought a first century Jewish home looks like. So that would be a mansion, a dwelling place in the first century in Israel. Now, when Jesus said, in my Father's house are many mansions, it is far more likely that his original audience would have thought of something like this, right? Not something like that, and not something like that. And so it took us maybe 3 steps, and honestly, we're still not sure that person in the first century actually wouldn't have heard the word mansion because Jesus wasn't speaking English. But the point remains that when we translate an idea, we assume, especially if it's written in our language, we assume that we're understanding the person who's speaking. Now, when you stop and think about this, if you've lived at all for very long with other people, you can quickly come to the realization that that's a really foolish presumption. I mean, who among us hasn't said something to a parent or to a child or to a friend or to a boss maybe or a coworker and had them completely misunderstand us? I was working with a guy once, and he said something about doing something completely. And I heard him say completely, and I thought, completely? What does completely mean to me? It means there's nothing missing. There's no lack. Completely means 100%. There's no portion that isn't included in that. And as it turns out later, he had in his mind maybe 60% or 80% or whatever, and it caused this sort of big disaster between us. And we were talking about it, and I said to him, I said, well, didn't you say that this was completely? And he said, well, yes, I said completely. And I said, well, how on earth why would you say that knowing that it wasn't all there? And he said, well, I figured you would have understood that given the circumstances, it wasn't all done, and that completely just meant all that was there was all that you could reasonably expect to be there. So you shouldn't expect any more. And I was like, the definition of the word completely involves nothing left over. But he didn't see it that way. And so we miscommunicated. Now, both of us were native English speakers, and in fact, we grew up in the same sort of cultural background. And so you would think that we would be able to communicate without much problem. But nonetheless, we had problems communicating. Okay? So I'll give you another other example that my apologies if you grew up speaking British English. It's this question: what do you call a bag? One of those things like a purse with a buckle that you wear on your side or on your rear. They were really big in the 90s. I couldn't find a good picture of it that I had the rights to show, right? Well, if you remember back to the 90s, and they still show up here and there today, you would know that we used to call them a fanny pack. It was kind of a slang term. We call them a fanny pack. Because in American English, the word fanny refers to your bum, your butt cheeks. It's kind of an informal slang term, and this is a bag that, slides around and it sits on your butt, and so you call it your fanny pack. Well, again, my apologies if you speak British English or international English, because that word in British English, it refers to a woman's anatomy. It is a very vulgar, obscene term. They just do not use it. And so in England, they would call that type of bag, they would call it a bum bag, a bag that sits on your bum. But they certainly would never call it as we do in America, because to them that would be, I won't use the English equivalent of what that would mean, because I would feel terrible saying that word on camera in a Christian podcast, right? And even now, like I realize, I don't realize, but I realize like there are people who cringe to hear me say that word. You should not, don't say that word. That's a terrible word. But to me, it has no negative connotations. In fact, that word is a sort of soft way of saying butt. It's more polite, it's more gentle. And it's because that term evolved in different ways in England versus America. And so our culture varies from place to place. You would call it a bum bag in England. And in fact, most places, if you go online and you try to find it advertised, they'll call it like a hip bag or something like that. Okay, so, and that's just if we speak the same language. Now we have this problem of communication is further compounded, not just by differences in language over time, say 1611 English versus modern English. It is also compounded across culture, like American English versus British English. But the problem becomes even more intense when we go from one language into another. So I bought a gift for our kids. It was some fishing lures, and on the fishing lures, which came from China, it said, "Caution, warm tips." And I was like, what does that even mean, warm tips? And then I read the little warning below it, and it said something about the hooks in the fishing lures being sharp and not to cut yourself on them. And I was like, I would bet that there's a Chinese idiom that is a figure of speech that literally translated means warm tips. And in their language, that means something is sharp or that it could cut you. But in English, of course, the word warm tips it's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. Now, if you put in the Chinese characters or words, I suppose, for sharp points, and you had it translate directly into English, it might come across as warm tips. But I assume if you put warm tips as English and you had them translate by Google back into Chinese, it might come out with a proper idiom, and they would know exactly what you mean. But the point being that idioms, figures of speech, ways of speaking are not consistent across languages. Okay? So I met a doctor last week who told me he often works with a translator, and he said that one time he asked her, a patient asked a question, and he just remarked, "Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." And he said the translator looked at him and went like, what does that even mean? Because you certainly can't just translate those words directly into Spanish. They don't mean anything. Like, we're in a doctor's office. We're talking about medical issues. What does that have to do with bridges and crossing them? And if you're familiar with the phrase, if you grew up with it, you're like, well, no, of course it doesn't have to do with bridges and crossing bridges. It has to do with making decisions, and making decisions when we actually have to, and not trying to come up with a decision that we may never actually need to make, right? And so this happens quite frequently with translations. I see this a lot in class. Actually, I really enjoy trying to sort out idioms and find equivalent figures of speech that work across translation. So one that I really, really like is this one. Okay, so in English we would say just in case. If we have a possibility of needing something in the future, but we're not sure we'll actually need it. We're going to go on a trip and we don't know if it's going to rain or not, because there might be clouds and there might not be. There's a 20% chance of rain. You don't think you'll need an umbrella, but you'll bring one just in case, right? Just in case it rains. If it rains, then we'll have the umbrella. Well, you can't translate that phrase just in case directly into Spanish. But if you want to express that same idea, then you would say that you would bring the umbrella por si las moscas. Right? Now, if you speak Spanish, you're like, yeah, of course. And if you don't, you're like, okay, so what's your point? Well, the point is this. The direct translation of por si las moscas is for if the flies. Right? For if the flies. What does that even mean, for if the flies? Well, what it means is, in English terms, just in case. But it's not a direct translation. Now, to somebody who grew up speaking Spanish, por si las moscas would be a very natural sounding thing. They wouldn't even think about it. It would just make sense to them. But if you grew up speaking English and then you learned Spanish and you learned the meaning to all these words, por si las moscas, and you were asked what it meant, you might go like, I have no idea. Or if you were asked to translate it, you would say for if the flies, and you wouldn't be able to access the meaning of it because it is an idiom. It's a figure of speech. It's something that represents something other than the direct meaning of each individual word separate. Okay, so where are we going with all this? Why do you care if por si las moscas, for if the flies? What does that have to do with anything, and why are we talking about it on this podcast? Well, here's why we're talking about it. I've recently had, actually not just recently, throughout many, many years, whenever I come into discussion with people about things they believe that are just not right. They're just completely like distorted. Usually it comes down to the idea that they have that and perhaps something they've even been taught, is that they should look for the plain meaning of the text. And, generally speaking, I think this is a good idea to have rattling around your head. Somebody tells you, like, now it's important that you would read the Bible, and you say, well, how do I read the Bible? Sometimes I go to church and my pastor explains things that it means that seem really strange to me. And someone might tell you, like, well, one of the best rules for interpreting the Bible, figuring out what it means, is that you should prefer the plain meaning of the text, or the simple meaning of the text. In other words, if there's one explanation that's really obvious, and one explanation that you can kind of see if you squint at it and, have this really good background that you might make sense of it, then you should assume that probably the simpler answer is true, right? That's what you should assume. You should assume that the plain meaning of the text is the true one. And hopefully you know where the problem is with this after a little bit of discussion. The real question comes down to this. If you're looking for the plain meaning, the question is plain or obvious to who? Who is going to find this plain or obvious? Right? So if the doctor said, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, the plain or the obvious meaning might have you thinking totally down the wrong road, right? You might be thinking about, what does bridges have to do with this? What does crossing bridges have to do with this? I don't understand. Well, apparently, like, maybe there's a bridge that we're going to have to go over to get to another hospital to do some tests or something. I don't know. That seems more obvious, right? And if somebody came to you and said, well, we won't really know the answer to the question until after we cross the bridge over to the other hospital and get this test done. And then you'd say like, oh, well, I guess that seems like it makes good sense, right? And so if you're a foreigner, you might ask the local English speaker, well, what do you mean by that? And they would explain it to you and you'd go like, yeah, well, I never would have come up with that in a million years. And you would say, okay, well, let's do that with a first century Jew. Or let's do that same thing with a Bronze Age Jew or Hebrew, right? Let's just go ask one of Abraham's friends what this particular word in Hebrew means. And of course, the answer is you can do that in English in your own context, but you can't do it if you go, if nobody is alive who spoke that language in that way. There are incredible difficulties with translating from ancient languages that we don't have any like modern fluent speakers to speak them with. And you could say, well, let's go find a Hebrew speaker today or a Greek speaker today and ask them what that means. But even that's no guarantee, as we saw with the word mansion. Ask an English speaker today what the word mansion is, and they'll tell you it means a big, nice house. And that won't help you understand the King James Version of the Bible. Okay, so we have this directive, this idea that we should just look for the plain meaning. But what we want is the meaning that would be plain to its original audience. And that is not always immediately or easily accessible. And so if you come to a pastor and he's trying to help you understand like how a Jew in the first century would have thought about this interaction between Jesus and his disciples or the Pharisees, and he knows that you don't really get all of the things they assume and their way of life. And so he has to explain to you what a shepherd was like in Israel in those days. And you're going like, well, why are you going on about all of this junk? Why can't you just tell me the plain, obvious, easy meaning of the text? And the answer is you can't understand the plain, obvious meaning of the text until you can think like a first century Jew. Otherwise, you will misinterpret what's going on there. And so in order to have it be obvious to you what it really means, you would have to think like the original audience. And that is a hard task to do. And this is one of the things, I think, that causes people, hopefully, as they grow in their faith and as they grow in their understanding of Scripture, that causes them to change their minds on things. Right? If I just get a Bible and I start reading it, I might come to some really bizarre conclusions, assuming that mansion, means a giant house or other things. And I might come to these weird conclusions. And then later on, somebody's going to explain to me that the word mansion actually 400 years ago didn't mean a giant house. It just meant a place where somebody lived. Then I would go like, oh, and then the next time I read that verse, I would read it very differently. And something different would seem obvious to me, right? So we're talking about things in John, and John is a really hard book of the Bible to understand because there are things in it that look obvious to us, but what's obvious to us is incorrect, I think. And that once you start to understand the way people talked and thought and the things that were going on in their heads and in their cultures and their figures of speeches, that once you understand a little bit more of that, you start to read the book of John and you see it differently. And it's the same as Romans or Ephesians or anything else in the Bible. Like in order to better understand it, you can't just read it again harder. You have to understand the context, the history, all of the messages and all of the assumptions that were going on in the language and in the communication of the original audience. But the reality is, my friends, that we can assume lots of strange things because we see a word, we think we know what it means, we see a phrase, we assume we know what it means, and then we just run with it. But if we're wrong in those assumptions, what seems obvious or plain or clear to us does not guarantee that it's actually simple and obvious and plain. And that, my friends, is the goal of Bible study. Not just to read it again and see what's obvious, but to understand more and more what the meaning as originally intended was. And that might require, and in fact I would say does require, some learning from sources outside of the Bible, parallel to the Bible, whether it's learning the Greek language or Hebrew, whether it means consulting commentaries or histories written by other people, whether it means consulting Jewish commentaries on the scriptures or talking to other people. That when we say that we base our belief only on the scripture, the most dangerous thing we can do is only read scripture to try to understand it. Because what we need is all of the other functions of language and culture coming together to help us understand what is actually taught and meant by the scripture itself.